It's a very great pleasure for me to introduce Richard Thieme. Richard is not easy to pigeonhole. He's been called a father figure for the online culture by the London Sunday Telegraph. CNN calls him a member of the cyber avant-garde. The editors of Digital Delirium have said that he's one of the most creative minds in the digital generation. He writes his own column called Islands in the Clickstream. Isn't that a cool image? Islands in the Clickstream. He writes for lots of different kinds of publications, Village Voice, Wired, Forbes, the Computer Underground Digest. He regularly speaks at organizations like Black Hat Briefings, and for those of you who don't know what that is, that's an organization that has conferences on intelligence and corporate security. He also speaks at DEF CON, and some of the tech folks in the room know what DEF CON is. The rest of you think it's just part of a movie. DEF CON is an organization of 5,000 or more hackers who come together every year to figure out how they can make their life and ours more interesting. And Richard was asked to moderate a panel in the year 2000 when the federal intelligence organizations and the Defense Department and the folks we work with through NERC, the infrastructure protection people, decided that this would be a good place to go and have a dialogue. And they asked Richard if he would moderate this because he was the only person in the audience that both sides respected. I've had the opportunity to see Richard on videotapes earlier, and I know that you're in for a real treat. Many of the ideas that he shared in those videotapes stick with me, but I just want to share one with you by way of introducing him, something that he said about himself. He said, "A lot of people think that I'm a futurist, but actually I'm just telling people what's happening right now, and they think it's the future." So, as Richard talks with us today about the human dimensions of technology in the workplace, please remember that he's telling us about what's happening right now, not what's going to happen in the future. Please join me in welcoming Richard Thieme.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very, very much. It's a pleasure to be with you and with some of you to be back. I have worked with the Wisconsin Utilities Association before, and I also spoke, and I used that as a benchmark for Wisconsin Power and Light for a different kind of meeting about 3 years ago, just when the merger was cranking up. And at that time, when I looked out at the mostly white, mostly male, mostly middle-class audience, a shocking image, I know, but some of you have stumbled into that situation before, it reminded me of the wonderful old Far Side cartoon by Gary Larson. Of all the people who retire early, he's the one I miss most. And Gary Larson once showed a dog up on a high wire on a unicycle. And it was out between the two platforms, out in the middle of the wire, kind of balancing there. It had one leg out around which 3 or 4 hoops were rolling. It had another leg out that was juggling 3 or 4 bowling pins. It had a long bar across its other legs with which it was trying to maintain its balance. It had a cat on its head that was jumping up and down. And way, 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 way below the unicycle and the dog and the cat, you could see the little round-like faces of the crowd. And the caption read, "High above the crowd, Rex tried to remain focused, but he couldn't shake one nagging thought. He was an old dog, and this was a new trick." So, I like to invite people to kind of flip the situation, be aware of what it is they're experiencing in the face of the kinds of radical change that are being caused by not only internet technologies, network technologies, but your technologies, and the way they're all interacting. Flip that and realize that everybody you're dealing with, those you manage, and the customers you serve, clients and customers, as well as people who report to you, they also are a little anxious and a little afraid in the face of radical change. Now, it has been my observation that if you know what people do, what is their default position when they are afraid, you can exercise real power by waiting for them to manifest that or anticipate it and by anticipating it, meet them at the point of their real need before they even know what their need is, therefore forming a partnership or bond which alleviates their anxiety and fear. Now, I'm going to do a short demonstration here. I've got to bring in a sports metaphor, but I'm going to do some that are counterintuitive. I want to use different kinds of sports. We've been hearing a lot about smash mouth football, alienating all of the women, or most of the women, and some of the men who don't watch it, as single dominating sports metaphors sometimes do. So I'm going to kind of shift the metaphor in a different direction, and I'm going to invite Errol to please come up and participate in a demonstration of how it works. There he is, high above the crowd. Okay, what I'm going to use is the martial art, really, of Aikido. And I'm going to show how it works. Stay cool, brother. Stay cool. This is the principle of Aikido. Would you please put your arm out like so? Now, what I'm going to try to do is push his arm down. All right, you get the idea. This is one strong dude. The harder I push, the more he resists, and the more I can't do it. Okay, thank you very much. No, stop right there. Stop right there. What is it that I said I wanted to do? I wanted to what? Push his arm down. Where is his arm? Down. How did I get it there? By pushing? No. The harder I pushed, the more I increased resistance against the point of pushing. All I had to do is stop pushing and say, thank you. And the arm went down. Why? Because he wanted it down. I was forcing him to resist and hold his arm in a natural position by putting leverage against it and forcing him to respond in a way that he himself did not want to do and was glad to surrender as soon as I gave him the space or permission to surrender. Thank you very much. Wonderful job. So, that is the point of Aikido. You do not oppose the energy of that you perceive as oppositional to you. You align your energy with it. If anybody knows about the flow of energy and aligning power with the flow of energy so you don't oppose it and frustrate it, but enable it to be the source of your own hitchhiking on it, it ought to be you people who are the source of the generation of the power in our lives. I'm talking about a different kind of power, though. I'm not talking about the power to dominate or control. Aikido and all the martial arts, in effect, are not about that, but Aikido is different in that it has no positive, aggressive moves. And yet when you watch an Aikido master at work, he or she is never bested because they are always in tune with what's going on around them. And when something comes at them, they assist it in completing the motion it wants to complete to no harm or little harm to themselves and as little harm to the opponent as possible. So how does that relate to if you know what someone does when they're afraid? Before I moved to Milwaukee, I lived on Maui. And I used to snorkel and scuba dive every day. I know it sounds hard, but sometimes the water was all the way up to 80 and you'd just come in and say, well, that was a little warm. So it wasn't. So life wasn't always easy, and we did get 6 inches of rain on that side of the island. And I found that I could catch some of the fish and put them in a tank. I'd just collect seawater, dump it in an aquarium in our house, which was on the beach. And there was one fish in particular, a Moorish idol, which I loved, big, long, black and yellow and white flowing fins. And I pursued it. I went after it. And the more I swam after it in the reef, the fish, being agile, nimble, and knowing where the little crevices were in the coral heads, always got away from me, disappeared. I could never catch it. So finally, I learned to not chase it. I stopped doing it. It doesn't mean you lose the intention of catching it. It means you patiently wait and observe the fish. And what I discovered is when that little Moorish idol went under the coral head, if I put in a stick or the net I was carrying at a particular angle, when it was afraid or threatened, it always came out at the same angle in relationship to its perceived threat. So what I learned to do was put in the stick here, hold the net here, and the Moorish idol caught itself. It always swam directly into the net because I knew what it did when it was afraid, and it always did it. If you know the default position of both clients and customers, and people you manage. When they are anxious or afraid, you can anticipate their move, meet them and head it off, address their real need, and form a partnership, because that is the source of the real security in the networked world that we all need so much. Okay, so what I want to emphasize today is both how things are changing, which is radically, but also how, in terms of some of the truths you have heard in the course of this conference, they are still the same and they will always stay the same. Sometimes knowing what's changing is important, but sometimes knowing what to keep and not throw out is just as important. 3 or 4 years ago, when I was at the Wisconsin Utilities Association, one of the CEOs was, I would say, emoting. He had had the experience of being part of a club. It was a warm, comfortable, familiar club. And when people went to the Wisconsin Utilities Association as executives of their utilities, they all knew each other. There was no competitive threat, so they all shared information. How are you doing? It was one big happy group, and this was the first meeting that year when they looked at one another with great suspicion, because they didn't know how to behave in relationship to one another now that they were competitors. What could they share? What could they not share? And one of those CEOs said to me, in the old days, which always means the good old days, we used to spend about 85% of our time and energy on the task of generating and distributing power, and maybe 15% on people stuff. Today, he said, I find myself spending 85% on people stuff and 15% on the task. In other words, one of the first noticeable effects of the impact of technology is not how it changes technological structures and systems so much as how it changes us. And under times like those, in times like those, when people are having to deal with radical change, then the job of leadership means managing people. And above all, understanding how you yourself, as a man and as a woman, as a human being, hold yourself in relationship to them, how you impact them, how you're perceived, how they feel, how the directives that you think are perfectly clear and self-evident are distorted. You cannot over-communicate during times of change. You cannot over-communicate because we don't get it. You say something and I'm anxious, you have to say it again. It's not because I'm stupid or contrary or being intentionally resistant. It's because the anxiety field keeps me from hearing it. So, leadership means becoming supremely self-conscious of your impact so the vision which you all share can be executed. And that's where the rubber hits the road. The difference, my friend Terry Paulson says, between a vision and a hallucination is that everybody can see a vision. You know? Okay. So, I want to look back at where you were a few years ago. At that time, when I spoke for Wisconsin Power and Light, it told me, as an entity, we are just about to complete a merger with a couple of other entities, and the dynamics of the merger were the biggest thing that people were confronting. Now, I am in a second marriage, and I have what we call euphemistically a blended family. Now, a blended family can best be understood if you go to an Osterizer and look at the buttons. It does have blend, but before you get to blend, you go through grate, chop, grind, and puree. And then, and only then, do you come to blend. And I remember telling this story about my family. My wife and I had just come back from our honeymoon. She had serious bronchitis, and I had the only case of shingles I ever had. High stress? I don't think so. Why were we stressed? She had 4 children, I had 3. I don't know what the problem was. Her youngest child was going to live with us. Her 3 oldest had left. My 3 and her youngest each had a pet. My 3 kids had 3 cats. Her kid had a dog. We put her 3 kids, her kid, my 3 kids, her 3 kids, her kid's dog, my 3 kids' cats in one house. And I went off happily to work. I came home the first day. I opened the door to come in. This is what poured out of the house. First, 1, 2, 3 cats, followed by 1 dog, followed by the 3 kids who owned the cats, followed by the kid who owned the dog, the cats meowing, the dog barking, and the kids screaming at the top of their lungs as they raced off in chaos down the street. My observation at that time was, that's a merger. That's a merger. And it's funny what people remember, isn't it? I don't know if if he's here, I don't remember who it was, but he got up and he said, oh man, he said, I'm just back from Iowa from a meeting. He said, that's a merger. That's a merger. Well, I don't bring up these buried memories only to cause you pain and anguish, but merely to say you've come a long way. You've come a long way in part because you did what that night I came home when we came back from our honeymoon, we called a family therapist in a week. We thought our kids were going to kill each other. So incapable did they seem of getting along with one another. And a friend of mine, Art Brown, a family therapist, came over and he spent the whole evening watching the dynamics. And he said what I can still say to you during your merger because it's not over yet. He said there's good news and bad news. The good news is this is a typical shakedown cruise. This is what happens. The bad news is it's going to go on for several years. And then he said what made the biggest difference to us, and I think applies to you too, because I've spent time with you and I know who you are, not only your heads, but a little bit more of your hearts than when I arrived. He said there are going to be times when you don't think you can do it, but you're going to make it through the darkest nights because you have the resources to triumph over this challenge. There were nights when the only thing between us and jumping out the window, although it was only second floor, so we just would have broken a leg and frozen to death, looked like idiots, was remembering that he said, go forward rather than back. You have the resources to do it. You are leaps and bounds ahead of where you were 3 years ago. You're in year, 2, 3 of a 5-year plan. You look at the generation side and what you've created. You look at what you're doing globally, which is a whole new way of playing this game. The benchmarks are all moving in the right direction. The employee satisfaction, which had a lot to do with how difficult it is to blend families, cultures, distinctions, and differences. I mean, I've lived all over the world, and I know that people think those in the next village or when I lived in Hawaii on the next island were the enemy, and we're never going to be like them. Don't minimize how tough it is. You are doing a very, very good job. Now, the challenges are that mergers are not over, that consolidation is not over, and that this sense of change, now we can sit back and relax. One of those CEOs said 4 years ago, we can move our people who are habituated to functioning in a more controlled and conservative environment into their zone of discomfort for a task. But once they achieve that task, they heave a sigh of relief and then fall back into the habitual patterns now that they've completed it. And what we're all discovering is that we're never out of the zone of discomfort. So it's not a sprint. It's a sports metaphor. It's a long distance run. And it requires a different kind of training and a different kind of discipline to do a long distance run. Above all, it's never going to stop. The rate of change continues to increase exponentially, and I'll say why in a few minutes. And therefore, you must take care of yourselves as human beings for the long run, as well as meeting the bottom line numbers and those driven, marketplace-driven, quarter-by-quarter results that seem to be the only thing that people respect in a short-term world. The biggest obstacle to your success in this endeavor is your past success, because we're in danger of doing that which always worked under conditions in which it no longer works. Therefore, you have to identify and do that which works so well that when you don't have time to think, you will execute it without thinking. A friend of mine, again, sports metaphor, practiced karate. He did nothing, he was a little obsessive. He went to the dojo every day. He practiced hours and hours every day. It became so deeply ingrained, so much a part of him, that he and karate were indistinguishable. It's what he practiced. It's what he did. And one night he came out of a neighborhood movie theater at midnight after the late show, and as he was turning the corner to go down the street to his car, he felt a hand come out of the darkness and grab him on the shoulder, and he turned around, and he broke the neck of his assailant. Except he discovered it wasn't his assailant. It was a friend trying to stop him so he could say hello. And this is the lesson, he said, he never will forget. Make sure that what you practice is what you want to do. Because when you don't have time to think, what you will do is what you have been practicing. This is why I think there is so much emphasis in this conversation you're having here on the formation of character and ethical behavior as a critical piece of your work, not something extraneous or added on. The formation of character means identifying the behaviors you want to execute when you don't have time to think about it, and then practicing them, so that when you don't have time to think, what you will do is what you have been practicing. You talk about it in terms of systems and processes. You also talked about it this morning in terms of focus. Well, I learned by weight training Another sports metaphor. It's really incredible what you can do when the chips are down, isn't it? I learned through weight training that it wasn't the weights. It was the form and the focus. And when you practiced on light weights and got the basics first, as you have heard, nailed the basics and got the form correct, then just adding weight was merely an incremental exercise. Form and focus. And I also learned that the muscles that give you the greatest strength are not the ones I thought, the pecs or the biceps or the quads. It's the abs. And when I heard a football coach say that the way he trained his football team for the season that they dominated was by having them do abdominal exercises day in and day out, hour in and hour out, because that provided the core strength out of which their endurance and ability to persist over a long-term season came. Then I realized that that was something that applied beyond the weight training room. So don't let your former success get in your way. This is from John Seely Brown. You might have known him, chief scientist at Xerox. It's a paradox or ironic that this is what he said. The more success you achieve, either as an individual or an organization, the more difficult it is to change. All of the learning that led to one kind of success becomes implicitly coded in you, and it works against your ability to unlearn. That's ironic that he said that at Xerox, which has had such a hard time reshaping itself and unlearning a way of being successful under conditions which no longer hold. So what do you do to develop the disciplines and the habits and the practices? Well, the key word is intention or intentionality. And I'm going to say a little bit more about what that means. Your intentionality, your real, now this is going to sound right brain to some of you, which means crazy. It's going to sound California to some of you, which means crazy. It's going to sound New Agey to some of you, which means crazy. But you know what sounds crazy? What sounds crazy is determined by context. I mean, let me give you an example. What I'm doing right now kind of makes sense. You provide the context for my behavior making sense. But if you all go away today and come back around 2 in the morning, and the room is empty and the lights are off, and I'm still up here doing this, you would conclude that my behavior was at the least a little marginal, would you not? My behavior would not have changed, but the context which gave it meaning would have shifted, and therefore the same behavior persisting under different conditions, what was wise becomes crazy, and what was crazy becomes wise. Craziness, insanity, like wisdom, is contextual. And so the ideas that really make the difference often sound crazy, especially in times of radical change. Robert Galvin, who built Motorola into an incredible organization, took it through transition after transition, developed a whole set of new ways of thinking. One of them was called strange ideas meetings, in which you could bring up any idea you wanted to entertain, and the only rule was you couldn't ridicule or reject it or laugh at it or stomp on the person who suggested it. And many of those crazy ideas, well, this is what he said when he was asked at the end of his career, and when somebody who builds a company like Motorola is asked after 40 years, what made the difference? And he reflects seriously for a minute and then answers, I pay attention. And he said, the ideas that turned out to be breakthrough ideas over the course of my tenure, every single one began its life as a minority opinion. A minority opinion. If it was heard at all, it was said by somebody on the margins, on the edge of the group. It was said by someone maybe who looked different. Those hackers I speak to look very different than you do. They wear black, they're heavily bodily pierced, they're majorly tattooed, and you might not even hire a bunch of them, but that would be because you don't understand yet that the partners you need wear uniforms and have appearances and ideas that are generationally different decade by decade. So when it's first said, it doesn't even sound. You said it, and everybody else kept talking. If you had the courage and the will, and if there'd been a culture that invited participation to continue, you might say it again. And then if people hear it, they laugh. Because literally, according to the model of reality in your heads, in our heads, the way we think, our paradigms, we can't entertain seriously radically new ideas at first. But if the person said it again, despite the laughter takes on an edge. It becomes derisive. It becomes ridiculing. And pretty soon you're putting down the person who said it. You go to an ad hominem argument. It's not the ideas anymore. You assassinate the character, well-being, and everything you can undermine of the person. You hire 60 Minutes to come in and do a 20-minute expose on them. You do everything you can to destroy their credibility and character. And then the idea arrives at the final point at the center when it is self-evident to everybody, and everybody says, we always agreed with that idea all along. That's how an idea, a breakthrough idea, moves from the edge to the center over time. Okay? The corollary, which Galvin also said, was this. Every time somebody suggested a plan of action or a way of proceeding, and everybody in the group immediately agreed that it was the right thing to do, it was always wrong. Now, he didn't say sometimes wrong. He said it was always wrong. Always wrong. Maybe this is what George Bernard Shaw meant when he said, all great truths begin as blasphemy. You can't hear it. Let me give you an example. How many of you, please raise your hands, how many of you believe that women should receive significantly lower wages, maybe about a third, of the wages of men for doing the same work? Would you please raise your hands? Okay, so there's only 2 of you back in the corner. And even then it was tentative. Okay, you know, all right. Everybody agrees. This is what consensus reality looks like. The truth is self-evident, and everybody agrees that it's true, and we always believed it, right? But when I remember, I'm old enough now to remember when Gloria Steinem first said things like that, it was such a radical idea that it wasn't even covered as an idea. People didn't hear it, and she said it again, and they laughed. The idea that women who are getting $20 an hour and men getting 60, that's the way it is. That's reality. People literally couldn't entertain the notion without laughing, and then they realized she was serious and starting a magazine to promulgate her radical feminist witching ways. Then they started attacking her. And you go back to the 70s and look at some of the character assassination attacks on Gloria Steinem, what they said about her then compared to now, that, you know, now when you get older, you're not as threatening and you're lovable. You're like an old building. You know, you're just kind of comfortable, and everybody goes in there and has a drink, and oh, yeah. But at the time, it was radically threatening, and the ideas as they promulgated through culture, from the edge to the center, the new ideas are arriving at the edge faster and faster. This is a function of the flow of information through our networks. Why? Because what human beings are, what an organization is, you ought to know this, energy and information. That's all we are. We're structures, boundaries around modules of energy and information. Some think information is merely energy that's become a little more conscious of itself, that that's all there is in the universe. So when the structures that determine the speed and the form of the flow of information and energy into our lives, i.e. our networks through which we all live and move now and have our being, restructure us in a symbiotic relationship in relationship to them, then inevitably the ideas are going to move faster and faster from the edge to the center, and we have to develop a means of capturing the radical, strange, and different ideas, because today's insanity becomes tomorrow's wisdom. Okay, so that was a prelude to saying this is a strange idea, intentionality. What you intend is what you get. What you really intend is what turns out. You don't have to get it out now, but I included an exercise in intentionality in the handouts. That's for you to do either at work or in relationship to your own life, because it gathers and collects and brings into consciousness what it is you really intend, because what you intend is what will happen. Way back when I was in another life, I don't want this to interfere with the flow, but I was once an Episcopal priest. For 16 years I did that work, loved it. God called me into it. God called me, bless his heart, out of it. And now I get to do this. I start writing and speaking about technology and its transformation of religion in the 80s. People literally thought I was crazy. That's where I learned that being crazy and being early are not always easy to distinguish. Stock market verifies that for us. And so I finally decided I had to be out here where the action was, because I wasn't going to transform the religious structures. They would come along in their own slow pace, and I had a finite period of time in which to live my life. All right, so while I was doing a parish in Salt Lake City, Utah, about 250 families, I developed a 12-hour day, an intensive 12-hour day designed to put people through these processes that would deliver them into a condition of absolute commitment, passion, and power. You can see the preacher coming out, okay? So my intention was to give this thing I created with the sweat of my brow or my brain to the parish and rejuvenate it, and I told them I was going to do it. And I prepared it, and I announced it, and I preached about it, and I told a few people about it, and I mentioned it at meetings. 1 week before the thing was to happen, 20 people out of 250 families had signed up. Okay, my initial reaction, and this is a confessional moment, was not benevolence, charity, and kindness. My initial reaction was I was really, what can you say, irritated. I was really frustrated. I was really angry. I was really resentful. And in that moment, I realized they were not appreciating what I was doing, and I was ready to quit and say, the hell with the whole thing. I'm not going to do it. And if I did, I would then have as justification for the rest of my life their refusal to accept my gift, and I could blame or lay responsibility on them and get out clean, so I thought. But I suddenly realized that either I meant it or I didn't. In the world we're describing, the only thing you have got is your word and your ability to communicate your word and deliver, make good on your word. So either my word was good or it wasn't. And if I meant what I said, that I'm going to give this thing to you, then I had to raise the level of yes I said when I meant, yes, I am going to do this thing and it's going to transform this parish. For the next 6 days, starting at 7:30 in the morning, concluding at 10:30 at night for 6 days, I called every single family in the parish. I did nothing but call people to enroll them out of disclosing to them what it was about. Many of those conversations turned out to be about other things. By the time I hung up the phone 10:30 on Friday night, what I realized is that the transformation for which I wished had already happened by virtue of my willingness and commitment to calling every single person. My commitment, my intentionality was manifest in those actions by willing to settle for nothing less than doing everything I knew how to do to accomplish it. So that Saturday, 80 people showed up. It was enough. It was a critical mass, and the thing did change the life of that organization. But the point I want to make is I had a place where I could have sold out, where I could have used the evidence available to justify my not doing one more thing. And that's the place we need to identify for ourselves, because that's where your breakthroughs have to come in leadership and execution. Where is the place where the evidence seems to justify your stopping because it supports you and your friends will agree that it supports you in not going any further, when in fact what is lacking is your will and above all your intentionality to make that thing happen. Okay, so the Tao Te Ching said, the hard and the mighty shall fall, the flexible and yielding shall survive. Leadership does not mean moving inexorably just down one. It means tacking back and forth across clearly held objectives so that you will use whatever strategies make themselves available to you at the time. You may not want to be leaders of this sort, but this is what the information revolution gives to you. This is Niccolo Machiavelli, 400 years ago, similar revolution caused by the Enlightenment and the printing press. He said, please remember, there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, nothing more perilous to conduct, nothing more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Well, by virtue of having chosen a safe route in a conservative regulated industry and having been blindsided by life, which seems to happen to all of us, you have been given this leadership, and it is your intention that will determine what you do. You have the power, but in a digital world, power is exercised a little bit differently. Why? I mentioned the symbiotic relationship between network computers and us. Marvin Minsky back at MIT put it this way. This years ago. He said, what do we mean by thinking? Well, he said, thinking seems to be the ability to hold in our minds simultaneously more than one idea. At least 2 or 3 or 4 ways of presenting reality that are sometimes mutually exclusive or contradictory, but holding them lightly and tentatively in our mind while we gather data and evidence from the environment around us, get the feedback, get the loops moving, full of information and energy that enables us to decide which is a reasonable course of action to take for now. He said, and one might even say that if you can only hold one idea in your mind and have no room for more than one in any domain, in other words, if you're a literalist or fundamentalist about anything, you might even be said not to be capable of thinking. We all have a member of our family like that, do we not? You know what it's like to try to have a conversation with them. There's no conversation. This is the fixed foot of the compass. You can either go for them or against them, but they're the standard. When people are rigid and fixed, which is fear-based and derivative of anxiety, they must have rigidity as their structure. They hold close to it, and they are threatened and terrified to leave it. So there's no conversation. You can't break that rigidity. The job is to pump up that anxiety. Fritz Perls, great Gestalt psychologist, said excitement is nothing but anxiety plus oxygen. Okay? So in the face of the changes we all face, we all feel anxious, but the kind of excitement that has often been manifested and breaks through here and punches in the, there's fear in the air. There's, my gosh, there's all this uncertainty in the environment. There's what's going to happen in California, but there is also a lot of excitement as you get in touch with what it is that you can do together to execute the vision that will give you control, that gives you security, and you're doing it through bonding with each other and through bonding with the clients and customers that you serve. So Minsky said, where is that kind of thinking taking place today? He said it's taking place on, call it the internet. It's taking place on the linked and networked systems of information where multiple representations of reality, images, words, text, can't have a meeting without this stuff. That's why I turn it off. This is a retro presentation, getting you back on the human being instead of the replication or simulation of the human being in digital form. It's just like a campfire. He said, the internet is where information and energy is moving. It's where images and ideas are happening. It's where the human mind, it's where the collective mind, the hive mind, if you will, is thinking its thoughts. And therefore, unless you're plugged into the internet, unless you're plugged into these networks or plugged into the networks of people who are plugged in, you will be said to be no more capable of thinking than a child raised by wolves in a cave who cannot speak the language of its tribe. You are no more than a desktop computer in a corner, not plugged into a network. You are a brain in a bottle, he said. Now, don't forget that when J.C.R. Licklider, a great psychologist who observed computing in 1957 before it meant anything like it meant now, spoke to a group of world-class scientists, he said to them, I can foresee a day when computers are plugged into each other and communicate with one another. These were Nobel Prize winners, and yet they could be observed from the vantage place at the back of the room going like this and going shoveling and rolling their eyes because he was so stupid and nuts, because their image of a computer was one of these huge ice-cooled mainframes behind thick glass, attended by high priests and gurus in white jackets, whose presence you could enter only with a password and a palm print or whatever. They thought of computers as these huge brainiacs, univacs. They didn't see what was right in front of their eyes. So when Pam says that I try to describe the present, it's true. If you haven't arrived at the present, it sounds like the future. It's why I have a job as a futurist. It's the biggest boondoggle on the face of the earth. Believe me. It is. All I do is come early, talk to you guys, feed back to you what I hear, integrate it with what I hear from other places, and I pick up a check. I mean, is this a deal or what? I think it helps to be honest with your audience. So you have some bonds of trust here, okay? So that was the internet then. What is it now? Well, increasingly, almost once it's gone. It's almost gone. Grove at Intel said 5 years, he said that 2 years ago, there will be no such thing as e-commerce. I heard somebody the other day say in my household, where we have lots of computers now, which was once as unthinkable as having lots of TVs, phones for you, I can't take it now, I'm on the internet. All right, well, how many times have you heard somebody say, I'm sorry, I can't answer the door, I'm on the power grid, because you've just pushed down the toaster, right? And yet, you bring somebody back from 1860 and show them the landscape of Galena or anywhere else, and what do they see first that you don't see anymore? You do, but most people don't. Power lines. Nobody sees it anymore. It's receded into the background noise of our lives. And we don't define it. We don't say, I'm on the grid. I can't talk to you now. I still remember when people in my house would say, I'm on long distance. Shush. I'm on long distance. Isn't that funny? Now we can call the near satellite that landed on Eros and have a conversation with it, and it's in real time and it's clear as a bell. The stuff disappears so rapidly into the background. Soon there won't be any more e-commerce any more than there's power grid commerce or telephony commerce. When the telephone was invented, nobody knew what was going to be done with it. Alexander Bell said, he was asked, what's it good for? He said, you could let the next town know that a telegram is coming. It's true. That's how far we can see in front of our faces. the most visionary people of the day. There's a quote from one who said, "I foresee a day when there will be a telephone in every single city." Every single city. Not one person foresaw that it was going to be a device for human personal communication, including its inventor. So how did we learn to become telephonic? So that if I don't hear those notes again, I'll be disappointed in the course of my speech. Somebody's got a phone on, somebody's got a pager on, something's going to beep, something's going to sing, something's going to chortle. You know, we're all wired nodes in a telephonic network. We learn to be that by engaging with the network and letting us transform us over time into the kinds of people that are literally not human if we don't use telephones. We become like the Unabomber, monks on mountains in Montana. Yeah? So that's what's happening in the internet. It's not temporary, it's disappearing, and something else will come. It's happening the way all change happens. How does change happen? Somebody said to Ernest Hemingway, "How do you go bankrupt, Ernest?" He said 2 ways, gradually and suddenly. Okay? Now, that's exactly the way new models of reality come. They sound crazy, they move in, pretty soon they're at the center, then everybody believes them. This profoundly affects how you think of everything, but I'm going to give you one example. Gosh, so much to say in so little time. The future. You've talked about the future and planning for the future. 3-4 years ago, I remember that, like so many who were trying to predict e-commerce, when you looked out at the non-regulated environment, every single prediction I heard then was wrong. Okay, so the good news is you've got lots of company. Human beings always get it wrong. This is a great relief. That's why the other handout I gave you is called Failing into Success. If you're not failing, you're not trying. It's called trial and error. You can't make an error. How did Edison invent the filament for the light bulb? By trying how many? 100, 110, 120. Every time he failed, he said, "Great, one more that I know doesn't work." On its way to the one that did. The future literally is not what it used to be. Why? Because the way we think of the future has been transformed by our participation in the symbiotic relationship with network computers. Let me just give you an example. 20 years ago, if you asked somebody to plan for the future, you'd use a program called Management by Objective. It looked like this. We want to go there. We're here. So we draw dotted lines from here to there. We'll take 5 years to get there. Think about the buried assumptions of that. One is that you know what the future is, and you can point to it and say, that's where we're going. The other is that you know where you are, which is just as crazy, and that you're going to get from here to there and know the route by which you are going to go. What are the assumptions of that? Stability. Stability and certainty. But our time is a time of instability and radical uncertainty. So what evolved as a restructuring of the very way we think about the future in the process of wiring ourselves in networks? I don't think it's an accident that it was 1973. Remember the OPEC oil crisis? Shell Oil said, what are we going to do? We didn't see this coming, lost billions of dollars. What was wrong with our strategy, our planning? What can we do differently so that we can have a better leg up on seeing what's coming? Out of that conversation, I don't want to make it too simplistic, but what evolved is now called scenario planning. Almost all businesses use it. The military has used it for a long time. Why? Because you have to be ready for any eventuality and have all sorts of contingency plans and fallback positions. So what is scenario planning? Well, let me use South Africa as an example, because it said that de Klerk, using scenario planning, when he was prime minister, began to envision a win-win future for the country that's precariously, but is still in existence. They got everybody together. To do scenario planning right, you have to recognize that not just engineers, not just literature majors, not just anything, everybody's wisdom is needed to be pooled and integrated so you can think together about the future. Okay? So they got everybody together, and they had these conversations, and they identified 3 or 4 scenarios. The least of them was called the ostrich. Why? Because if we don't do anything, put our head in the sand, and ignore what's happening, what's likely to come about? And they looked at the political and economic and so on consequences, and what they saw was bloody civil war. The best one they called the flight of the flamingos. It said that de Klerk saw that it was win-win because he saw that blacks in South Africa could achieve full political power, and whites would not have to surrender their economic power, and therefore both could have a stake in the future of South Africa as they envisioned it. Flight of the flamingos, they fly a long way, they don't get tired, they rotate later. You know all the bird metaphors. Make it a sports metaphor. Okay. All right. Just to stay with the theme. Flamingo is delicious. It's kind of like trumpeter swam or loon. It's pretty good. It's pretty good. Okay. So think about what scenario planning looks like. You know, it's no accident. If this, then that. If this, then that scenarios connected by logic gates, and, or, and not. In other words, the very way that computers were designed in their bowels, so to speak, in their chips, to structure information logically, if this then that scenarios through logic gates, became the de facto way that human beings learned they had to think. Because there is no such thing. This is going to sound crazy, but don't throw it away. There is no such thing as the future. There is no such thing as the future. The future, what we call the future, is a construction of reality here and now. It's how we hold ourselves in the present as possibilities, intentional possibilities for action toward the future we intend to create. And therefore, the only way of obstructing the future you want to create is to refuse to become fully conscious of who you are and what it is you can achieve. There is no future. There is no such thing as the future. And therefore, when you say, what are the futures? We now say there are multiple futures, and you hear this conversation everywhere in the world. There are multiple possibilities of future scenarios, and the one that is likely to manifest is the one that we collectively as humankind intend to manifest, and human beings are extraordinarily resilient. You look at what businesses are doing in California in response to the power crisis. They're slicing and dicing the hours they use it. People are not fools. It's not one thing happens and nobody reacts. Everybody reacts. The system is responsive and complex and resilient. So, what does it look like to think that way? This is a guy named Les Shipman. This is a long time ago, 1998, years ago. He was hired by Mohawk Carpeting. Mohawk Carpeting was having difficulty allocating their resources in order to maximize their productivity. Okay? Why? Because they were basing their productivity on past orders. Well, that only makes sense in the former world. What actually happens is what's going to happen. Therefore, you base your productivity allocations on what has happened. They hired Les Shipman, who wrote neural net software that enabled them to discern through the software patterns that human minds could not see. Now, Mohawk allocates over 60% of its productivity, of its resources, according to possible patterns of the future discerned by the software. Symbiotic relationship. Human beings can't see those patterns, but the software can, and it now allocates its productivity in a completely different way. Its productivity has gone way, way up as a result. The software is a filter, a simulation that is retraining us how to think about the future. That's why you have to be plugged in to as many different disciplines as possible to challenge yourself in your current level of thinking. Okay? Now, unfortunately, this is the introduction to my talk. And so I'm going to have to do the other 57 minutes in 14. Okay. So I may talk fast. You think I've been talking fast? You haven't heard anything yet. So I may be talking fast to get this done, and I won't get it done. Okay, what does it change? One, the way power is exercised in a web is different than the way power is exercised in a hierarchy. This has a lot to do with intentionality. I once did a First Star Bank. I can use their name because they're no more. They were Star and then they're First Star and now they're something else. Okay, and I keynoted an organizational planning retreat as they were looking out ahead at the future of banking. The cover of Banking magazine said, Bill Gates was on the cover, and he said, "Banks are dinosaurs." You know, so these middle-aged white male people came into the room quaking and perspiring because they could hear the big Tyrannosaurus Rex coming for them. Well, things don't work out that way. When you get afraid, just step back. It's not gonna happen that way. It can be much worse, you know? Now, this is what interested me. There were about 20 people in the room for that retreat, and I'd interviewed each one of them for about an hour, and every single one of them was a smart, resourceful, competent, wonderful human being. Like when you talk one-on-one with all you, everybody is incredible in this room. And yet every single one of them said, the thing that's frustrating me is the bank. The bank is in the way of my executing these plans. And when I got them in a room in a place like this, around the table, I could simply say, "Excuse me, but where's the bank?" And you look around a retreat center like this and you realize, where's the power grid? Well, here you can see symptoms of it, but where is the bank? The bank that frustrated them was the bank in their heads. You see, they had been conditioned and socialized and trained, like Celie Brown said, to work successfully in a hierarchical structure where power is exercised by dominating and controlling, where there's one box here connected to a box here and a box here. So you think of yourself as only one person in each box. Therefore, the only way to get ahead is to knock somebody out of the box or wait for them to die or retire. et cetera, et cetera. The bank, in their heads, the model of activity, of behavior, of structure, was what frustrated them because they were the bank. You know, you are Alliant Energy. You are the matrix of energy and information. The human network is most important. How is power exercised in a network? Not by dominating and controlling, but by participating and contributing. Participating and contributing. So you try to dominate a network, your energy dissipates along all of the filaments that take it away into the far future. You cannot control and dominate a network. The network pushes power into the hands of those who are on the front lines. And the people on the front lines know what's going on, and the more power you give them, this changes your role in leadership from dominating, controlling, to managing, to coaching. So, another sports metaphor. Why has coaching come up so often? Because it doesn't work anymore to dominate and simply instruct. You have to be available, not only when they're afraid, as I said about the fish, but whenever people really need your intervention. A coach isn't talking to the players all the time. He or she does pep talks, and they know when to strategically intervene, but most of the time is spent on empowering and building the systems and processes and structures that give people power, and then people exercise that power by participating in the network and contributing. And ironically, this is what builds the security we all need in such an insecure world. We feel connected, we feel bound to each other. It's why these initiatives, everybody's talking about them, how you're taking care of customers. Not everybody used to think like that. What's his name? Not The Far Side. Dilbert. Dilbert. Who writes Dilbert? Scott Adams, right. Scott Adams said, he was remembering back when he first went to Pac Bell, and he first started, and he said, back in the 70s, he says, that was a day, he said, when everybody was promoted way beyond their level of competency. You know, when everybody freely acknowledged that customers really just didn't matter. And he paused and he said, it was a time of joy. You know? Well, those times are gone forever. We're talking about what works. I went to a Zen monastery once, and a monk came out, and he bowed to us. And he said, do you know why we bow here at the monastery? And people said, oh, you're acknowledging the divinity, and they all had religious and spiritual answers. But he said, no, we bow because things work better when you bow. And that became for me ever after a definition of practical spirituality that translates into the workplace. You're trying to find out what is it that you do that works. So where do you go for this? Pam mentioned I work with hackers. I love these guys. I go to the kids because the kids teach me what I need to know. Why did a 50-year-old man make alliances with people who have blue hair, who are doing dastardly deeds in the middle of the night? I know when I say hackers, I know what image comes to mind. You think of some whacked-out loner hunched over his glowing monitor in his bedroom at 3 in the morning, cackling like Beavis or Butthead while he breaks into your bank account. And that's no more than 3/4 of the guys, honestly. The other quarter are focused entirely on the grid, and I won't have time to talk about that. Oh, I have a whole module on that because I do work with intelligence and security and people and the hackers, and oh, God help us when it happens. No, this is the essence of hacker. Jeff Moss used to be known as Dark Tangent when he brought those guys out of the desert, 100 for the first time. Now they're 5,800 at DEF CON. He said to me when I was in the old days, when I was 6 and 8 and 10, and learning how to hack, he said, man, I could crack any game, I could get into any PBX, I could get into any system, any Unix system, I could break any Linux box. There wasn't Linux then, but I'd break any Sun Spark station. He said, I could crack anything. He said, now there's too much to know. He's 20s now. He says, now there's just too much for one person to know. So he said, the most important thing I need to know is what I don't need to know, because there's too much to know, and therefore the next most important thing I need to know is who knows it, so I can get it when I need it. Okay. Now, he's talking about the essence of relational networking. This is from a kid with blue hair who had to hide out for 3 days in Vegas because the police were looking for him because of something he was doing. I mean, this is wisdom. This is where you go for wisdom. It's the people. The people are the network. I talked to Ameritech once. It took 2 weeks to get through to a human being because I was lost in voicemail. I finally got a human being on the line. This is a communications company, right? You know, and you wanted to shake the voice. And the voice said, because she was on the front lines and knows exactly what's up, the higher you go, excuse me, Earl, but the higher you go in a company, the more the truth of the company turns into the company lie. Now, not here, not here. not here. But this is why Timothy Leary said, you never get the truth from the company memo. Where do I go? I go to the people on the front lines, the receptionists. 10 minutes with any receptionist. What's it like here? You get the whole picture from the corner, the unobstructed view. So this woman knew the story, and she said, we fired way too many people way too fast. We thought we could just plug new people into the network. You know what we found out, she said? I said, what? She said, the people are the network. The people are the network. What the computer is doing to human beings, I don't want to get too science fiction-y on you, but it's creating a cyborg. A cyborg is a symbiotic relationship between human flesh and machinery, so tight and so interwoven that you can't separate one from the other. We work for the computer. We are embedded in the computer and it in us. We created it, it's recreating us, and this is moving on up the line. Mr. Hoffman mentioned when I spoke here a few years ago for Wisconsin Power and Light, remember the teleportation thing. That was a thing that sounded crazy. I'd written an article about teleportation and got emailed that told me literally, you are crazy, it's impossible. Within 6 months, quantum teleportation had been done in 3 laboratories around the world. Now we have done atomic teleportation. So now what they're saying, because then they said atomic teleportation is impossible. Now they're saying, oh, but molecular teleportation is impossible. You know, I talk to people on the edge. I don't think anything is impossible. I don't think anything is impossible. It sounds crazy. You can't know it all yourself. You have to learn to exercise power as a node in the network. And this is why communication has become so critical. Every transaction you have, this is a function of your intentionality. You are the brand called Alliant Energy. Every encounter and conversation you have is a manifestation of Alliant Energy. Every interface you create in which you build a relationship based around the fact of being Alliant Energy, that makes Alliant Energy real in the world, in the mind, in the perception of the people with which you engage. Therefore, every single one of you, like a node in a network, because in a network, every node is at the center. Every single one of you is 100% responsible for communicating the totality of what it is you intend for Alliant Energy to become. We are never, ever off the hook. So the brand is not the product. The transactions in which you engage, as well as delivering and executing, that is the brand. And it is a function of your intentionality. You create it from absolutely nothing. And that's why every conversation you have with someone who reports to you or with customer or client, when you reach that point that I reached, where because the resentment, anger, and bailing out was justifiable, I was tempted to do it, in that moment, remember and know that you have an option, which is to create from nothing something more binding, significant, and real than that. You are responsible for the conversation in the company. The conversation is what determines the culture. And instead of expecting anyone external to you to create it and bring it to you or for it to filter down, you have the power to create it in every single moment. How can you create a culture that will radically open itself to new ideas? Oh, that beloved First Star Bank. A guy came up to me and he said, when I came to my first meeting, I noticed everybody in the room was staring at me. And when I looked around, I saw that they all had suits and ties and white shirts on, and I had a suit and a tie and a blue shirt on. And I walked back through the bank to my office, and I noticed everybody else had a white shirt on, and I had a blue shirt on. He said, I've never worn anything but a white shirt for the last 8 years, and you know what they call me? The guy in the blue shirt. The guy in the blue shirt. So I was overjoyed to see one guy with an earring here, because it indicates that slowly, 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 appearance is becoming less important than contribution. When I work with those feds and they say we don't hire hackers, I say, how do you know? And one of the top FedCert guys says to me, oh, they have blue hair and they're pierced. And I said, are you crazy? The hackers tell me the easiest way to get information with which they can do what they want to do is come to meetings like this and talk to people. I will just share with you that by presenting myself as if I am credible, I have received enough information from about 8 or 10 conversations to know how to bring down the grid. It was my intention to learn that before I left. It just took one day of hanging out being friendly and credible, and asking a few questions. And then people, when they have the bond of trust, give you enough information that if you can connect the dots and use the internet and your allies selectively, you can be mischievous. I don't have time to talk about competitive intelligence and why all those people from intelligence are migrating. Motorola, their CI department was started by Jan Herring from the CIA. Former KGB guys are working for the Russian mafia. They're working for the transnationals. The boundaries around our structures, as you know from your forays into the international field, are dissolving. But boundaries are what gives us identity. It's so big, we can't get our minds around it. Nation states that we think are real are dissolving. And transnational, metanational organizations are replacing them in many countries because they have more power than those countries. Some African nations are wholly owned subsidiaries of the Russian mafia. And the Russian mafia are so much better than the Italian because they went to all the capitals of the world and they're smart. They come out of the gulag. They hire PhDs in computer science. They move money. My friends at the NSA show me the maps of the money that moves around the world. Citigroup, one of my stock holdings, sheepishly admits, well, yes, maybe a little money. You can't not launder money if you're doing global banking today. You can't not be in collusion. These structures of power are emerging in the shadows, and only if we look at them with rigorous honesty and clarity do we see what's really going on. Well, that's a strange idea. That's a strange idea. The only solution to responding to all this, and I'm going to bring this to conclusion, is to build structures that are antidotes to the anxiety that I've described. And those are structures of mutuality, feedback, and accountability. Mutuality because the people are the network and you can't do it alone and you can't know enough alone. And therefore you have to rethink and get feedback about how it is you impact the people you work with because your job is being changed as a leader from someone who directs to someone who empowers and enables. Feedback means, as you know, in a system, the loops of feedback are more and more and more necessary, dependent on the speed with which things are changing. If the ocean comes up to here only once every 100 years, you don't need to have an evolutionary adaptation, but if it does it every 24 hours, then you're better adapt to it. So you need constant feedback inside and outside the system, and there has to be rigorous accountability to mutually agreed upon goals and objectives, the kinds of things that you discussed at this meeting. I go to the edges to see what's coming. In the technology world, I'll just mention very briefly, the edges are best discerned where people don't often look. First, the military. I ask the people I know, the deepest sources I can reach in intelligence and aviation, what are the technologies that are evolving? They are so far beyond science fiction, we can't even describe them. The new technologies emerge in the military because without them we would not be who we are, we must have them. Therefore, you look at robotics, you look at sensors, you look at integrated functioning units that have more chips in them and in their systems than they have people. You look at the way the network is re-evolving humanity. I look at genetic engineering to see how we are going to restructure the kinds of human beings we want to design. You are the last generation to be merely born. Might as well face it. From now on, it's designer time. Well, how many manic depressives do we want? I don't know. Not an easy question. You know how many there are? 4%. 4%. As evolution factors in attributes, that's a high number. Why are there a high number of manic depressives? Well, you talk to Ted Turner, he says, man, I never did a deal I didn't love except during my manic phase. He's willing to risk suicide by not taking his lithium. I'm willing to go down because it's worth it to go up. Well, maybe 4% contributes massively to the Human Genome Project, and we might have chosen 1 or 2%. How many mystics do we want? The answer is just enough. Somebody's got to keep the power grid going. You don't want you sitting there wrapped in ecstasy when there's a malfunction. So let that be my job. And I'll tell you about it, and you keep the lights on so I can see what I'm doing. So you go to the military, you go to genetic engineering, you go to children and see what the kids are playing with. When I was a kid, I read I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, science fiction. But then as I grew up, I started learning a computer program language named Logo, developed by Minsky at MIT, that enabled you to build little simulated robots. But now you can go to the toy store. I knew it, I knew it, I knew it. Thank you for validating my perception. Telephonic Society. You can buy a robot, Lego robot, that kids build now. Go to see what children are playing with in order to see what's evolving next. Why did Sony, when they were evolving the PlayStation 2, the executives, the designers, sat behind one-way glass, brought in a whole bunch of 10-year-olds, let them go to town on the prototypes? Because the kids invented new ways of using the PlayStation 2 that the engineers who designed it never would have dreamed in their wildest imaginations. So look at what kids are playing with, because that's how society socializes its new citizens to have the skills and attributes it wants them to have up the road. And we, middle-aged, white males, have gotten maybe a little more structured in our thinking than what those kids can reveal to us. The last place to go is, I say this with trepidation, it is being recorded, but I have to throw it out. When you're looking for where technology is evolving, you go to where people are paying for it. That's entertainment, but the subset where it's really evolving fastest is the sex industry, right? So now I'm not saying go to the sex industry and look at its products. I'm saying keep one eye shut while you observe what technologies are being used there, because when people are willing to pay $4 a minute for a 2-inch by 2-inch box in which a little digital doll is dancing and waving its hand at you like this, then you know that there's a lot of cash flow. And there's a lot of research and development. And be honest about who makes that money. The porn money is not made by, I've investigated on this, did articles on it. It's not the sleazeballs like Larry Flint. It's GM. It's Marriott Hotel. Do you know 75, 85% of in-room revenue at hotels comes from the porn channels? I mean, General Motors has it because they have a satellite now, Hughes, but Hughes is going to probably be bought by Murdoch. The satellite people, the pay-per-view people, the hotel people, these are the kings of porn. It's in the balance sheet. It's not hidden. It's just that nobody wants to expose it, because if you look at the interlocking directorates of the newspapers that cover those companies in the, quote, business section, unquote, you're not going to get that story. So, conclusion. Okay. Things to do. You want things to do. Entertain strange ideas. Have strange idea meetings. When people are talking about putting chips in their heads, they're not kidding. When they're talking about faster than light, they're not kidding. I know a physicist who has a contract with NASA to develop faster-than-light technologies. When they're talking about quantum teleportation, they're talking about instantaneous communication. When we're talking about a spacefaring society that we are already becoming, we're talking about the edge that is already in the center. When I talk to astronauts, when I talk to people in aerospace, and they tell me about the strange vehicles that flew rings around them when they were test pilots, that were shaped like discs and self-luminous or metallic, and which, when they took off after it, moved from 0 to 4,000 faster than any earthly technology could move. I'm sorry, I don't mean to go there. I just wanted you to see what it's like when a strange idea comes into the room. Everybody gets very, very quiet. Did he say what I think he said? Is he saying, is he? Well, yeah. When an astronaut who's walked on the moon tells me he's talked to the intelligence community, and this is what people who talk to the Joint Chiefs of Staff tell him about what's going on, about the management of the phenomena and how it's perceived, I pay attention. When I connect the dots from all these people that I talk to, I'll do an article about it. You'll see, people will say I'm crazy, and they will ridicule me. And that's if they even notice. But to think that this is it, this little species that's crawled out of the mud a couple million years ago, we're just climbing out of a swamp. You know, we're just going out into our own little solar system in a universe of billions of planets and billions of stars. Please. So you want to entertain new ways of generating energy. When a friend stands outside Edwards Air Force Base all night with night vision equipment and shows me a videotape of what he calls the dripper, because here's a plane that comes like a golden luminous arrow through the sky on past Edwards out toward where they call it Area 51 these days, and he says, what the heck is that? And he takes it to JPL, and the physicists look at it and they say it's a bifurcated plasma. It's probably generated by the ionized skin on the multiple layered skin of this experimental craft. This is 7, 8 years ago. You know, entertain new possibilities for energy. Build structures of mutuality and feedback and accountability, because it provides the security we all need and also does the job. Be highly intentional about the most difficult things, which are how you are perceived, and execute your leadership by the way you are being. Go to the edges, exclude nothing, consider everything, then think it through. Go to different domains than those which affect your thinking most of the time, and borrow, beg, and steal ideas from everybody and everywhere, because, as the Zen monk said, that's what works. And above all, be prudent, wise as serpents, yet innocent as doves, as you execute your plan with a very clear intentionality. You are a blended family. You can get through what's come, what's here, and what's coming. When my daughter, who is now 21, came into my life at 3 and wouldn't speak to me for years because I was less than the furniture in the room to her, because she did not want this man there married to her mother. And she went to college and gave me a Father's Day card that said, I know you think I haven't noticed anything you've been doing for 15 years, but I really have. You've taught me the meaning of unconditional love. That's intentionality. Many nights I didn't think I could do that, but somehow, together, cooperating together, we find the way. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.